Clara's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. Emma was having trouble with her fur feedings. The nipple flow was too fast for her age. I used my own money. That's not the point. James stepped closer, his presence suddenly intimidating in the spacious kitchen. The point is that I gave you specific instructions, and you ignored them. Margaret called to inform me that one of her other clients saw you at Baby Depot, making purchases that could reflect poorly on this household's management. I was trying to help Emma. You were trying to prove you know better than the professionals who've been caring for her. This is exactly the kind of overstepping I warned you about. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mr. Blackwood, I've been around children. I can see when something isn't working. Can you? His voice was dangerously quiet. Because from what I understand, you never successfully had children of your own. So perhaps you should stick to following instructions rather than playing mother to mine. The words hit like a physical slap. Clara's vision blurred momentarily, the old shame and pain rushing back with devastating force. She gripped the counter to steady herself, dimly aware of Emma beginning to fuss in her bouncer seat. James seemed to realize he'd gone too far, his expression flickering with something that might have been regret. But instead of apologizing, he doubled down. I'm calling Margaret in the morning. One more incident like this, and you're gone. Are we clear? Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. James retrieved Emma from her bouncer and disappeared upstairs without another word, leaving Clara alone in the kitchen with the bitter taste of humiliation in her mouth. She finished preparing his dinner in silence, her hands shaking as she arranged the plate. When she carried it to his study, he didn't look up from his computer. Leave it on the desk and close the door behind you. That night, Clara lay awake listening to Emma cry. The baby's distress seemed to go on for hours, punctuated by James's heavy footsteps as he paced the halls. At one point, she heard him on the phone again, his voice strained. I don't know what else to try, Mom. She won't stop crying. Maybe I should just hire a night nurse. No, I can handle this myself. Around 3 in the morning, the crying finally stopped. Clara crept to her door and listened, hearing only silence. She wondered if James had finally figured out the bottle issue on his own, or if Emma had simply cried herself to sleep from exhaustion. The next morning, she found James in the kitchen, still in yesterday's clothes, bouncing a fussy Emma while trying to prepare a bottle one-handed. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his usually perfect hair was disheveled. Good morning, Clara said quietly. He barely acknowledged her, focused on measuring formula with the precision of a scientist. Emma's cries grew more frustrated as she watched him struggle with the bottle preparation. Clara watched for a moment, then said carefully, Would you like me to take over the feeding? James's shoulders sagged slightly. Fine, but use the bottles exactly as they're labeled. Clara took Emma and the bottle, noting immediately that he was still using the fast flow nipple. As expected, Emma struggled and grew more upset. Clara glanced at James, who was watching with increasing frustration. She's impossible, he muttered. 3 nannies couldn't figure her out. And now, Mr. Blackwood, Clara interrupted gently. What if we tried a different approach? His eyes flashed dangerously. I thought I made myself clear yesterday. You did. But Emma is trying to tell us something. Babies don't cry without reason. And you think you understand her better than her own father? The challenge hung in the air between them. Clara looked down at Emma's red, tear-streaked face and made a decision that would change everything. Yes, she said quietly. In this case, I do. The tension in the Blackwood house became suffocating after Clara's quiet challenge. James began watching her with the intensity of a hawk, noting every interaction she had with Emma, every minor deviation from the rigid schedules he'd established. But Clara had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She'd seen Emma's genuine need and couldn't turn away. Margaret Hartwell's surprise visit came on a Wednesday morning, while James was at a business meeting in the city. Clara answered the door to find the older woman standing on the porch with a clipboard and an amorous smile that never reached her eyes. "Clara, dear, I thought I'd stop by and see how you're settling in. May I come in?" It wasn't really a question. Margaret swept into the house with the authority of someone who'd placed dozens of women in similar situations. She made notes as she walked through the rooms, occasionally pausing to run a finger along surfaces or peer into corners. "The house looks lovely," she said, though her tone suggested she was checking items off a list. "And how is little Emma?" "She's napping upstairs," Clara replied carefully. "She's been doing much better with her feedings." Margaret's pen stopped moving. "Oh, Mr. Blackwood mentioned there were some adjustments made to her routine." Clara felt her stomach tighten. "Minor ones. She was having difficulty with the bottle flow rate." "I see." Margaret made another note. "You know, dear, Mr. Blackwood specifically requested someone who would follow established protocols. He's had quite enough of nannies who think they know better than trained professionals. I wasn't trying to overstep. Of course not." Margaret's smile grew sharper. "But perception is everything in this business. Other families talk, Clara. They share experiences with their help. If word gets around that you're unreliable, it reflects poorly on my agency." Clara Matthews had never imagined her life would come to this. Standing in the sterile waiting room of Hartwell Family Services, clutching a manila folder containing her entire existence reduced to paperwork, she felt the weight of every whispered conversation that had led her here. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across her face as she watched other women come and go, some with children, some without, all carrying their own burdens. At 32, Clara had been widowed for 3 years. Her husband Michael's sudden death in a construction accident had shattered more than just her heart. It had revealed the cruel reality of how quickly a woman could fall from grace in a small town like Millbrook. The whispers started almost immediately. "Poor Clara," they said. "No children to comfort her. What a shame she never could give Michael what he wanted most." The fertility issues had haunted her marriage for 8 years. Endless doctor visits, treatments that drained their savings, and the gradual cooling of Michael's family toward her. When he died, the will reading became a bloodbath. His brother David had made it clear. The house, the small inheritance, everything would go to family members who could actually carry on the Matthews name. Clara was left with nothing but her maiden name and a crushing sense of failure. That's when Margaret Hartwell entered her life. Margaret owned the most successful domestic staffing agency in the county, placing housekeepers, nannies, and companions with wealthy families throughout the region. She was a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair pulled into a perfect chignon and eyes that missed nothing. When she looked at Clara across her mahogany desk, it felt like being appraised. "You understand the arrangement, dear," Margaret said, her voice honeyed but firm. "The Blackwood family has very specific needs. Mr. Blackwood is a widower with significant business interests. His late wife left him with a 6-month-old daughter, and he requires live-in help. Someone reliable, discreet, and ... She paused, consulting Clara's file. Someone without complications. Clara's cheeks burned. She knew what that meant. Someone who wouldn't get pregnant and disrupt the household. Someone who wouldn't pose a threat. Someone broken enough to be grateful for scraps. "The salary is generous," Margaret continued, sliding a contract across the desk. "Room and board included, of course. But Mr. Blackwood values privacy above all else. What happens in his home stays in his home. Are we clear?" Clara nodded, though something cold settled in her stomach. She signed the papers with trembling hands, feeling like she was signing away more than just her employment terms. The drive to the Blackwood estate took her through Millbrook's affluent district, where manicured lawns stretched like green carpets and houses stood like monuments to success. The Blackwood property sat at the end of a tree-lined drive. A sprawling colonial with white columns and black shutters that spoke of old money and older secrets. James Blackwood answered the door himself, which surprised her. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe late 30s, with dark hair showing the first traces of silver at the temples. His suit was expensive but rumpled, his tie loosened like he'd been wrestling with it all day. In his arms, he held a baby girl with wide dark eyes and wispy brown curls. "You must be Clara," he said, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion. "I'm James. This is Emma." The baby looked at Clara with curious eyes. One tiny fist wrapped around her father's finger. "She's beautiful," Clara said softly, and meant it. Something in her chest loosened slightly at the sight of the child. James's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Margaret explained your situation? Good. I need someone who won't get attached. Emma's had 3 nannies in 6 months, and they all started thinking they could replace her mother. I won't have that confusion in my home." Clara felt the words hit like a physical blow, but she kept her face neutral. "I understand, Mr. Blackwood. The previous nanny left detailed notes about Emma's routine. Follow them exactly. I work long hours, travel frequently. As long as my daughter is cared for and the house runs smoothly, we'll have no problems." He showed her through the house with brisk efficiency, the kitchen with its commercial-grade appliances, the nursery painted in soft yellows and greens, her own room on the 3rd floor that felt more like a servant's quarters despite its neat furnishings. Throughout the tour, Emma remained quietly alert in his arms, occasionally reaching for something that caught her interest. "One more thing," James said, as they returned to the foyer. "I host business dinners occasionally. When I have guests, you'll serve but not participate in conversation. These are important people with important business, and I can't have ... double quotes." He gestured vaguely. "Complications." That night, as Clara unpacked her few belongings in the small 3rd floor room, she could hear Emma crying downstairs. The sound went on for nearly an hour before it finally stopped. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the desperate wails that seemed to echo her own silent screams. She'd thought she was being rescued from her circumstances. Instead, she was beginning to realize she'd simply traded one prison for another. But Emma's face floated in her mind, those bright, curious eyes that had looked at her without judgment, without pity, without the weight of her failures. Maybe, just maybe, this little girl needed rescuing too. The first sign of trouble came during Emma's morning feeding on Clara's 3rd day. The baby had been fussing all night, her cries echoing through the halls of the big house while James remained locked in his study, fielding business calls from overseas clients. Clara had listened from her room, hands clenched in her bedsheets, every maternal instinct she'd buried screaming at her to help when morning came. James thrust Emma into Clara's arms with barely concealed frustration. "She won't take the bottle. The formula is exactly as the notes specify. Maybe you'll have better luck." Clara looked down at the red-faced, exhausted baby and immediately saw the problem. Emma's tiny mouth was working frantically, but she was getting mostly air instead of formula. The nipple on the bottle was too fast-flowing for such a young baby. "Mr. Blackwood," Clara said gently, "I think she might need a slower nipple. This flow is probably overwhelming her." James's jaw tightened. The previous nanny never mentioned any problems with the bottles. "Follow the routine exactly as written. Clara, I don't pay you to improvise." Clara bit back her response and spent the next hour watching Emma struggle with the feeding, managing only an ounce before exhausting herself. When James left for his office, Clara quietly drove to the nearby baby store and bought slow-flow nipples with her own money. Emma took 4 ounces immediately and fell into the first peaceful sleep Clara had. Witness. She decided not to mention the change to James. If Emma was content, what harm could it do? But Margaret Hartwell had spies everywhere. The call came that evening while Clara was preparing dinner. James's voice carried from his study, cold and sharp. I see, yes, I understand. It won't happen again. He emerged from the study with his phone still in hand and his expression thunderous. Care to explain why you were seen purchasing baby supplies today? I was very clear about following established routines. The threat was clear. Clara nodded, feeling the walls closing in around her. Margaret continued her inspection, ending in the kitchen, where she spent several minutes examining the baby supplies. I notice you have some items here that weren't on the original inventory list. I purchased those myself when Emma was having feeding issues. How enterprising of you, Margaret made another note. Of course, you understand that unauthorized purchases could be seen as criticism of Mr. Blackwood's parenting choices. We wouldn't want that misunderstanding to spread. After Margaret left, Clara found herself jumping at every sound, waiting for the axe to fall. She reverted to using the fast-flow nipples, watching Emma struggle with her feedings, while her heart broke a little more each time. The baby's weight gain slowed, and her sleep became fitful again. James noticed the change immediately. She's crying more again, he said accusingly one evening as he handed Emma to Clara for her bedtime routine. Yes, sir, Clara replied, not meeting his eyes. I thought you had everything figured out. Clara bit her tongue and carried Emma upstairs, where she held the fussy baby and whispered apologies she couldn't voice aloud. The breaking point came during one of James's business dinners. He'd invited 6 potential investors to discuss a resort development project, and Clara had spent the day preparing an elaborate meal. As she served the main course, she overheard fragments of their conversation. The environmental impact study should be manageable, one man was saying. The wetlands designation is only preliminary. What about the local wildlife preserve? Another asked. James waved dismissively. A few well-placed donations to the right conservation groups should handle that. Besides, who's going to miss a few acres of swampland? Clara nearly dropped the serving dish. She knew the area they were discussing, the Millbrook Nature Preserve, where she and Michael used to walk on weekends, home to several endangered bird species and a critical watershed. As she returned to the kitchen, she heard James's voice growing more animated. The beauty is, we can fast-track the permits if we file before the new environmental protections take effect next month. By the time anyone raises objections, we'll have groundbreaking scheduled. One of the investors laughed. Nothing like beating the system at its own game. Clara stood frozen by the kitchen door, Emma's evening bottle growing cold in her hands. She thought of the herons that nested in those wetlands, the hiking trails where families took their children to learn about nature, the water filtration system that kept Millbrook's drinking water clean. When she carried Emma upstairs for bed, her mind was racing. She'd stumbled onto something that could destroy an entire ecosystem, and she was trapped in a house where she wasn't allowed to have opinions, much less voice concerns about illegal environmental damage. Emma fussed in her arms, still struggling with the feeding issues that Clara wasn't allowed to address. As she looked down at the baby's frustrated, tear-streaked face, Clara felt something crystallize inside her. She'd been so focused on keeping her job, on staying invisible, that she'd forgotten who she used to be. Before Michael's death, before the fertility struggles crushed her confidence, she'd been an environmental science teacher. She'd taught children to love and protect the natural world. She'd fought for school recycling programs and organized community cleanups. That woman had been buried under years of loss and shame. But Emma's trusting eyes reminded Clara of all the young faces who'd looked to her for guidance. All the students who'd learned to see wonder in wetlands and beauty in bird migrations. Margaret, Hartwell, and James Blackwood thought they'd found the perfect victim, a broken woman desperate enough to stay silent, grateful enough to ignore wrongdoing, invisible enough to witness crimes without consequence. They had no idea what they'd actually brought into their house. As Emma finally fell asleep in her arms, Clara made a decision that would either free them both or destroy what little security she had left. She was done being invisible. It was time to remind everyone that some things were worth fighting for. The morning Clara decided to fight back, Emma wouldn't stop crying. James had left for the office in a fury after another sleepless night, muttering about calling Margaret to find a replacement. Clara walked the floors with the inconsolable baby, knowing exactly what was wrong, but forbidden to fix it. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she whispered into Emma's downy hair. "I know you're hungry. I know it hurts." The fast-flow nipples were making Emma gulp air with every attempt to feed, causing painful gas that kept her awake for hours. Clara had watched this suffering for 2 weeks, following James's rigid rules while a baby paid the price for adult power games. Emma's cries grew hoarse and desperate. Clara looked at the clock. James wouldn't return for hours. She made her decision. She drove to Baby Depot and bought not only the right nipples, but also anti-colic bottles designed to reduce air intake. When Emma took her next feeding without struggle and fell into peaceful sleep for the first time in weeks, Clara felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just about following orders anymore. This was about protecting someone who couldn't protect herself. That afternoon, while Emma napped, Clara did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She opened her laptop and began researching. The Millbrook Nature Preserve environmental protection laws were clear. Any development within half a mile of designated wetlands required extensive impact studies and public hearings. The fast-track permitting process James had mentioned was not just unethical. It was illegal. Clara found the contact information for the State Environmental Protection Agency and the local chapter of the Audubon Society. She crafted careful emails, outlining what she'd overheard and providing specific details about the timeline and companies involved. As she hit send on the last message, Emma stirred in her crib. Clara went to check on her and found the baby looking up at her with bright, alert eyes, no longer the exhausted, frustrated infant of recent weeks. "You feel better now, don't you?" Clara murmured, lifting Emma gently. "Sometimes we have to break the rules to do what's right," Emma gurgled contentedly, her tiny hand wrapping around Clara's finger with surprising strength. That evening, James returned home earlier than usual, his expression stormy. "Margaret called me today. She said there were reports that you were seen shopping again." Clara had prepared for this moment. "Yes, sir." Emma was showing signs of colic, and I thought, "You thought wrong." James stepped closer, his voice dangerously quiet. "How many times do I have to tell you to follow the established routine?" The routine was hurting her. "That's not your decision to make." Clara looked at him, really looked, and saw not a grieving widower trying to care for his daughter, but a man so consumed with control that he couldn't see past his own need to be obeyed. "Isn't it?" she asked quietly. "When a baby is in distress and I have the knowledge to help her." James's face flushed with anger. "You have knowledge? You're a failed wife who couldn't even have children of her own, working as a glorified servant because no one else would hire you. Don't mistake desperation for expertise." The words hung in the air like poison. Clara felt the familiar shame try to rise up and swallow her, but something new pushed back. Emma's contented sighs from her bouncer. The memory of her former students, excited faces when they spotted their first great blue heron. The knowledge that she'd once been someone who mattered. "You're right," Clara said, her voice steady despite the pain. "I couldn't have children. My marriage fell apart because of it. I lost everything and ended up here, grateful for scraps." James's expression shifted, perhaps expecting capitulation. "But that doesn't make me wrong about Emma, and it doesn't make what you're planning to do to the wetlands right either." The color drained from James's face. "What did you say?" "I heard your dinner conversation last week. About the resort development. About bypassing the environmental protections. You were eavesdropping?" "I was serving dinner in my own employer's house." You weren't exactly whispering. James moved closer, and for the first time, Clara felt genuinely afraid. You need to be very careful about what you think you heard. Very careful about what you might say to anyone. Is that a threat? It's a reminder that you're easily replaceable, Clara. There are dozens of women just as desperate as you were. Women who understand that discretion is part of the job. Clara glanced at Emma, who was watching the exchange with solemn eyes, as if she could sense the tension crackling between the adults. What if I quit? James laughed, but there was no humor in it. With what reference? You think Margaret won't make sure every agency in the state knows exactly why you were terminated? You'll never work in childcare again. You'll be lucky to find work cleaning office buildings. The threat was real, and they both knew it. Clara had no family to fall back on, no savings to sustain her during a job search, no network of friends to provide support. She was trapped in a system designed to keep women like her silent and grateful. But as she looked at Emma's trusting face, Clara realized something had changed. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a baby who deserved better than a father more concerned with control than care. She was fighting for wetlands that supported countless species. She was fighting for the woman. She used to be the teacher who'd inspired children to protect the natural world. You're right, Clara said finally. I am desperate. I do need this job. But Emma needs someone who will put her well-being first. And the community needs someone to speak up when powerful people break the law. James's eyes narrowed dangerously. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Then educate me. But do it quickly, because I've already sent emails to the State Environmental Protection Agency. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Anna seemed to hold her breath. James's voice, when it came, was deadly quiet. You've made a very serious mistake, Clara, one that's going to cost you everything. Clara nodded, surprised by the calm that settled over her. Probably, but some things are worth losing everything for. As James stormed from the room, already reaching for his phone, Clara picked up Emma and held her close. Whatever happened next, she'd finally remembered who she was supposed to be. Clara didn't sleep that night. She could hear James pacing in his study, his voice carrying through the walls as he made phone call after phone call. She caught fragments, containment, liability, permanent solution that made her stomach clench with fear. By morning, she'd made a decision that terrified and liberated her in equal measure. She was going to document everything when James left for the office. Without speaking to her, Clara began her methodical investigation. She started with Emma's medical records, which she found in James's desk drawer. Her heart sank as she read the pediatrician's notes from the past 6 months. Multiple visits for feeding difficulties, failure to thrive, and persistent colic. All issues that could have been easily resolved with proper bottle selection. More disturbing were the notations about James's behavior during appointments. Father appears frustrated with infant's needs. Declined recommendation for lactation consultant. Refused suggestion to try different feeding methods. Clara photographed every page with her phone, her anger building with each dismissive note about Emma's struggles. Next, she turned her attention to the environmental crime she'd witnessed. James's home office was a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. She found contracts with development companies, geological surveys of the wetlands, and most damning of all, a folder labeled Regulatory Workarounds that contained detailed plans for bypassing environmental protections. One document made her hands shake with Rage's strategy memo outlining how to neutralize opposition through selective intimidation of key stakeholders. Her name appeared on a list of potential threats to project security. As she photographed the documents, Emma babbled contentedly from her bouncer, finally thriving with proper feeding equipment. The contrast between the baby's innocent trust and the calculated cruelty in these papers was stark. Clara's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Environmental Protection Agency. Received your report. Would like to discuss. Can you meet today? Her heart raced. The authorities were taking her seriously. She texted back quickly. Yes, but need to bring 6-month-old baby. The response came immediately. Understood. 2 p.m. at Millbrook Public Library. Ask for Agent Rebecca Martinez at Information Desk. Clara spent the morning preparing Emma's diaper bag and organizing her evidence. As she was printing copies of the most damaging documents, she heard a car in the driveway. Through the window, she saw Margaret Hartwell's black sedan pulling up to the house. This wasn't a coincidence. Clara quickly hid the evidence and met Margaret at the door, Emma on her hip. Clara, dear. Margaret's smile was sharp as broken glass. We need to have a conversation. They sat in the living room, Emma playing with her teething ring while the two women studied each other like chess opponents. James tells me you've been having some adjustment issues, Margaret began. I've been caring for Emma and maintaining the household as requested. Have you? Because I'm hearing about unauthorized purchases, violations of established routines, and now ... Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. Some very concerning accusations about Mr. Blackwood's business affairs. Clara kept her expression neutral. I don't know what you mean. Of course you don't. Margaret leaned forward. Clara, I'm going to be very frank with you. You're a troubled woman with a history of instability. Widowhood, fertility issues, financial desperation. These things can affect a person's judgment. Make them see threats where none exist. Make them fabricate stories for attention. The implication was clear. Clara felt ice form in her veins. That would be unfortunate, Margaret continued, because if such a woman were to make false accusations against a respected businessman, the consequences could be severe. Defamation lawsuits. Criminal charges for making false police reports. Complete unemployability. Emma dropped her teething ring and began to fuss. Clara automatically soothed her, buying time to think. On the other hand, Margaret's tone became honey-sweet. If that same woman were to realize she'd made some errors in judgment, sought professional help for her emotional instability, and focused on being grateful for the generosity she'd been shown. Well, everyone makes mistakes. What kind of professional help? There's a lovely private facility upstate. Very discreet. They specialize in women who've experienced trauma-related delusions. Insurance covers extended stays. Clara's blood ran cold. They weren't just threatening her job anymore. They were threatening her freedom, her sanity, her very existence. And they could probably do it a desperate woman with no family, no resources, making wild accusations against pillars of the community. Emma reached up and touched Clara's face, her tiny fingers soft against her cheek. In that moment, Clara felt a strength she'd forgotten she possessed. This baby depended on her. The wetlands depended on her. The woman she'd once been was fighting to survive. I need to think about what you've said, Clara replied carefully. Margaret smiled triumphantly. Of course, dear. Take all the time you need. But not too much time. James is a patient man, but his patience has limits. After Margaret left, Clara packed quickly. Whatever happened at the library meeting, she couldn't return to this house. She loaded Emma's supplies into her car, along with a hidden folder of evidence, and drove toward town with her heart hammering against her ribs. Agent Martinez was younger than Clara had expected, with kind eyes and a professional manner that put her somewhat at ease. They found a quiet corner of the library where Emma could play while they talked. Your report was very detailed, Martinez said, reviewing Clara's written statement. These are serious allegations. I have documentation, Clara replied, pulling out copies of the contracts and memos. Martinez's eyebrows rose as she examined the papers. This is substantial evidence of environmental law violations. Where did you obtain these? I work in Mr. Blackwood's home. I witnessed the dinner conversation and found these documents in his office. You realize this puts you at considerable personal risk? Clara looked at Emma, who was contentedly chewing on a board book. Someone has to speak up. Martinez made notes as she reviewed each document. We'll need you to testify, probably in front of a grand jury. Are you prepared for that? I am. But there's something else you should know. They're threatening to have me committed to a psychiatric facility to discredit my testimony. Martinez looked up sharply. Explain. Clara outlined Margaret's visit and the thinly veiled threats. Martinez's expression grew grim. That's witness intimidation at minimum. Possibly conspiracy. She closed her notebook and looked directly at Clara. Ms. Matthews, I'm going to be honest with you. This is going to get ugly. These people have resources and connections. They're going to try to destroy you. I know, but you're willing to proceed? Clara glanced at Emma, who was now pulling herself up against Clara's chair, bright eyes full of trust and determination. In that moment, Clara saw not just a baby, but all the students she'd once taught, all the children who deserved a world with clean water and protected habitats, all the vulnerable people who needed someone to stand up to bullies. Yes, Clara said firmly. I'm ready to fight. The raid on Blackwood Industries happened at dawn on a Thursday morning. Clara watched the news coverage from a cheap motel room across town, Emma asleep in the portable crib beside her. Federal agents swarmed James's office building while reporters spoke urgently into cameras about environmental crimes and conspiracy charges. Agent Martinez had moved quickly after their library meeting. Within 24 hours, Clara's evidence had been verified by multiple departments and federal warrants had been issued. Clara had spent the night in protective custody, giving her formal statement while Emma played with toys provided by victimservices.now, watching James being led away in handcuffs on the morning news. Clara felt an unexpected mix of satisfaction and sadness. She'd won the first battle, but the war was just beginning. Her phone rang. Margaret Hartwell's name appeared on the screen. Hello, Clara. The older woman's voice was ice cold. I assume you're enjoying the morning's entertainment? I'm watching the news, if that's what you mean. How unfortunate that your delusions have caused such disruption. Of course, when this all falls apart, and it will, everyone will remember who made the accusations. Everyone will remember how unstable you were. Clara had expected this response. Margaret was already working to control the narrative, painting Clara as an unreliable witness whose testimony would crumble under scrutiny. The evidence speaks for itself, Margaret. Does it? Evidence obtained through illegal searches of private property by a disgruntled employee with a documented history of mental health issues? Evidence that could be explained away as misunderstandings taken out of context? Clara's confidence wavered slightly. Margaret was right that her access to the documents could be challenged in court. But here's what you didn't consider. Dear, Margaret continued, James Blackwood isn't just a businessman. He's a pillar of this community, a grieving widower trying to raise his motherless child. When people learned that his trusted nanny betrayed him, stole from him, and then made vindictive accusations to cover her crimes. What crimes? Oh, Clara, did you really think we wouldn't notice the missing items? The jewelry, the cash, the silver candlesticks? Poor James, trusting a desperate woman out of the goodness of his heart, only to be robbed by someone he'd tried to help. Clara's blood ran cold. That's not true. I never took anything. Prove it. Prove that you didn't take advantage of James's grief and Emma's needs to steal from them. Prove that your accusations aren't just an attempt to deflect from your own crimes. The line went dead. Clara stared at her phone, realizing how naive she'd been. While she'd been gathering evidence about environmental crimes, Margaret and James had been preparing their counterattack. They were going to destroy her credibility by framing her for theft. An hour later, the local news was already shifting the narrative. A reporter stood outside the Blackwood house, interviewing neighbors who spoke about James as a devoted father and generous employer. One woman mentioned seeing Clara acting suspicious and carrying bags to her car at odd hours. Clara's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Martinez. Need to meet immediately. Complications have arisen. They met at the same library corner, but Martinez's demeanor had changed. She looked tired and frustrated. The defense is claiming prosecutorial misconduct, Martinez said without preamble. They're saying your evidence was obtained illegally, that you had no right to search private documents. I was caring for Emma. I had access to the house. That's not the same as having legal permission to photograph confidential business documents. The defense is filing motions to suppress everything you provided. Clara felt the bottom drop out of her world. What does that mean? It means we might not be able to use your evidence in court. Without it, we don't have enough to prosecute. But the environmental damage will continue unless we can prove criminal intent. And now there's another problem. Martinez slid a folder across the table. They filed theft charges against you. Grand larceny. The items they claim you stole are worth over $10,000. Clara opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were photographs and jewelry, cash, and silver pieces she'd never seen before. Each item was meticulously documented, with receipts showing their purchase dates and values. I never took any of these things. I believe you. But they have security footage of you in areas of the house where these items were stored. They have testimony from Margaret Hartwell that you had access and opportunity. And they have character witnesses ready to testify about your financial desperation. Emma stirred in her stroller, reaching for Clara's hand. Clara took the tiny fingers in hers, drawing strength from the contact. This is retaliation for my testimony. Of course it is. But that doesn't make it less effective. If you're facing felony charges, your credibility as a witness is compromised. The environmental case becomes much harder to prove. Clara stared at the photographs of items she'd never stolen, feeling the trap closing around her. So they win? Martinez was quiet for a long moment. Not necessarily, but we need to change our strategy. Instead of relying solely on your evidence, we need to find other ways to prove the environmental crimes. How? By getting James Blackwood to confess. Clara laughed bitterly. He's not going to confess to anything. He's too smart for that. Maybe, but desperate people make mistakes. And right now, James is very desperate. Martinez explained her plan. Clara would wear a wire and meet with James, ostensibly to negotiate a settlement of the theft charges. If she could get him to admit to the environmental crimes on tape, they could use that confession regardless of what happened to her original evidence. It's dangerous, Martinez warned. If he suspects what you're doing, things could get very bad very quickly. Clara looked at Emma, who was babbling quietly to herself, completely oblivious to the adult drama surrounding her. This innocent child deserved a father who wasn't a criminal. She deserved a world where people in power couldn't destroy wetlands without consequence. I'll do it. Clara, you need to understand, if this goes wrong, you could end up in prison. The theft charges alone could get you 5 to 10 years. Emma would go into foster care or back to James's custody. The thought of Emma growing up with a man who cared more about control than her well-being was unbearable. But the thought of the child losing the only stable caregiver she'd known was equally devastating. There has to be another way. Martinez shook her head. This is our best shot. But I won't force you to take this risk. Clara spent the rest of the day walking around Millbrook with Emma, trying to decide what to do. She passed the public elementary school where she'd once hoped to teach, the park where families brought their children to play, the library where she'd first learned to love books and learning. This community had abandoned her when she was most vulnerable, but it was still home to hundreds of innocent people who didn't deserve to have their water supply poisoned by illegal development. That evening, She called Martinez. "I'll meet with James, but I want guarantees about Emma's safety." "What kind of guarantees?" "If something happens to me, she doesn't go back to him. She goes to a family that will actually put her needs first. I can arrange for Child Protective Services to be standing by. If James is arrested, Emma will be placed in emergency foster care. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than leaving the baby with a man who saw her as property rather than a person." Clara made the call to James's lawyer, requesting a meeting to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution to the misunderstanding. Meeting was scheduled for the next afternoon at James's office, neutral ground, with witnesses present. As Clara prepared for what could be her final free act, she held Emma close and whispered promises she hoped she could keep. "Whatever happens tomorrow, sweet girl, I want you to know that someone fought for you. Someone chose your well-being over their own safety. And someday, when you're old enough to understand, I hope you'll know that you were worth every risk." Emma looked up at her with trusting eyes, and Clara felt her resolve solidify. Some battles were worth losing everything to fight. Clara's hand shook as she adjusted the tiny recording device taped beneath her blouse. Agent Martinez had insisted on multiple backup systems, a wire transmitter, a digital recorder in her purse, and a tracking device sewn into her jacket collar. If something went wrong, at least there would be evidence of what happened. "Remember," Martinez said through the earpiece during the final equipment check, "get him talking about the environmental violations. We need him to admit to knowingly bypassing the wetlands protections. And Clara, if you feel unsafe at any point, get out immediately." Clara nodded, though her throat felt too tight to speak. Emma was safe at a protective services facility, being cared for by trained professionals who didn't know her real name or connection to the case. It had broken Clara's heart to leave her there, but it was the only way to ensure the baby's safety. James's office building stood like a fortress in downtown Millbrook, all glass and steel, reflecting the gray October sky. Security cameras tracked Clara's movement as she walked through the lobby, signed in at the desk, and took the elevator to the 20th floor. The receptionist led her to a conference room where James waited with his attorney, a sharp-featured woman in an expensive suit who looked like she could cut glass with her stare. James himself appeared haggard. His usually perfect appearance showed signs of stress, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that made him drum his fingers constantly on the table. "Clara," he said, not bothering to stand, "I have to admit, I didn't think you'd actually show up." "We need to resolve this situation," Clara replied, taking the seat across from them. For everyone's benefit, the attorney, who introduced herself as Patricia Wells, slid a folder across the table. "This is a very generous settlement offer, Ms. Matthews. In exchange for returning the stolen items and signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, Mr. Blackwood is prepared to drop all criminal charges." Clara opened the folder, scanning the legal documents. The non-disclosure agreement was ironclad. She would be legally forbidden from discussing anything she'd seen or heard while working in James's home, including the environmental crimes she'd witnessed. "Where exactly am I supposed to get $10,000 worth of jewelry and silver that I never stole?" Clara asked. James leaned forward, his voice cold. "Don't play games with us, Clara. We know you took those items. Just like we know you photographed confidential business documents and violated the trust we placed in you." "The trust you placed in me?" Clara felt anger flare in her chest. "You mean the trust to stay silent while you poisoned wetlands and neglected your daughter?" Patricia Wells held up a warning hand. "Ms. Matthews, I'd be very careful about making additional false accusations. The defamation lawsuit alone could bankrupt you." "False accusations?" Clara turned to James. "Tell me, James, when Emma was crying every night, when she couldn't keep her feedings down, when she was losing weight because the bottles you insisted on using were wrong for her age, was that false too?" James's jaw tightened. You overstepped your authority. I made it clear that you were to follow established routines, even when those routines were hurting her. Emma is my daughter, not yours. You had no right to make those decisions. Clara felt the wire against her skin and knew she needed to steer the conversation toward the environmental crimes. And the wetlands development? Did I have no right to be concerned about that either? Patricia Wells started to interrupt, but James held up his hand, his face flushed with anger. You had no right to be eavesdropping on private business conversations. No right to steal confidential documents. And certainly no right to interfere with legitimate business operations. Legitimate? Clara pressed. Bypassing environmental protections is legitimate? We weren't bypassing anything, James snapped. We were following proper procedures to fast-track permits for a development that will bring jobs and revenue to this community. By filing before the new wetlands protections take effect. By making donations to conservation groups to keep them quiet. James's face went pale as he realized how much she'd overheard. Patricia Wells was frantically making notes, clearly trying to figure out how to control the damage. You don't understand the complexities of environmental law, James said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Sometimes you have to work within the system to achieve the best outcomes for everyone. Work within the system? Clara pulled out her phone and showed him photos of the documents she'd found. Is this working within the system? James lunged for the phone, but Clara pulled it back. The movement caused her jacket to shift, and James's eyes fixed on something at her collar, the small bulge where the tracking device was. Hidden. You're recording this, he said, his voice deadly quiet. Patricia Wells stood immediately. This meeting is over. Ms. Matthews, you've just committed a serious crime by secretly recording privileged attorney-client communications. Clara's hard-hammered as she realized her cover was blown. This isn't privileged communication. I'm not your client, but my client was present, and you violated his privacy rights, Patricia said, already pulling out her phone. I'm calling security. James stood slowly, his earlier nervousness replaced by something much more dangerous. You stupid woman. Do you have any idea what you've done? Through her earpiece, Clara heard Agent Martinez's urgent voice. Clara, get out now. We've got enough. Get to the stairwell immediately. But James moved to block the door, his presence suddenly intimidating in the confined space. You think you're so clever, don't you? Think you can destroy everything I've built to protect some swamp? It's not just some swamp, Clara said, backing toward the windows. It's a critical ecosystem. It filters the water supply for half the county. I don't care if it filters water for half the state, James snarled. I have $40 million invested in this project. Investors who expect returns. Contracts that have to be honored, even if it means breaking environmental laws. Especially then. James's mask had finally slipped completely. You think laws apply to people like me? You think your little recording is going to matter when I have senators and judges on my payroll? Patricia Wells was pale now, realizing that her client was confessing to crimes on what was obviously a recording device. James, stop talking. Now. But James was beyond reasoning, his fury and desperation overriding his judgment. No, let her hear this. Let her understand exactly how powerless she is. I own this town, Clara. I own the police chief who'll investigate your theft charges. I own the judge who'll sentence you. And I own the politicians who write the environmental laws you think you're protecting. Clara's phone was still recording, capturing every word. Through her earpiece, she could hear Martinez coordinating with local law enforcement, but she needed to keep James talking. What about Emma? Clara asked. What happens to her when you go to prison for this? James's expression shifted, becoming almost confused. Prison? I'm not going to prison. You are. You're going to be convicted of theft, and when you try to testify about these supposed environmental crimes, Everyone will know you're just a bitter ex-employee trying to get revenge. People will see through that. Will they? James smiled coldly. A barren woman who couldn't keep her own husband happy, so desperate for a child that she kidnapped mine, so delusional that she convinced herself she was saving the world? The jury will eat that narrative up. Clara felt ice form in her veins as she realized the full scope of their plan. They weren't just trying to discredit her testimony. They were preparing to destroy her completely, painting her as an unstable woman whose accusations were the product of a disturbed mind. But as James continued his rant, detailing exactly how he planned to corrupt a legal system and manipulate public opinion, Clara realized he was also giving her everything she needed to prove his guilt. The conference room door burst open as federal agents swarmed in, weapons drawn. Agent Martinez led the charge, her voice cutting through the chaos. James Blackwood, you're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery of public officials, and violation of federal environmental protection laws. As they handcuffed James, his eyes locked on Clara's with pure hatred. This isn't over, he hissed. I'll destroy you for this. Emma will never know you existed. Clara smiled through her tears, thinking of the baby who was safe in protective custody and the wetlands that would remain protected. Emma will know that someone fought for her. And that's enough. 6 months later, Clara stood at the edge of the Millbrook Nature Preserve, watching a great blue heron wade through the crystal-clear water of the protected wetlands. The morning sun cast golden ripples across the surface where endangered species still thrived, thanks to the preservation order that had been fast-tracked through the courts. After James Blackwood's arrest, Emma toddled beside her, now 14 months old and thriving under Clara's legal guardianship. The custody battle had been swift once. Child Protective Services reviewed James's parenting record and the evidence of his criminal behavior. No judge wanted to place a child with a father serving 15 years in federal prison for environmental crimes, bribery, and conspiracy. Bird, Emma declared, pointing at the heron with chubby fingers. Big Bird. That's right, sweetheart, Clara said, lifting Emma to get a better view. That's a great blue heron. They're very special birds that need clean water to survive. Emma clapped her hands in delight, her dark eyes bright with curiosity and joy. The contrast between this healthy, happy child and the sick, frustrated baby Clara had first met was remarkable. Proper nutrition, consistent care, and most importantly, being treated as a precious individual rather than a burden had transformed Emma into the thriving toddler she was meant to be. Clara's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Martinez. Jury deliberation took 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Margaret Hartwell gets 5 years. Thought you'd want to know. Clara smiled at the news. Margaret's domestic staffing agency had been revealed as a front for placing vulnerable women in situations where they could be exploited and silenced. The investigation had uncovered dozens of cases where women had been threatened, manipulated, or worse, when they tried to speak up about illegal activities in their employers' homes. The civil lawsuit settlements from James's assets had provided Clara with enough money to buy a small house near the preserve, where she'd converted the spare bedroom into a home office for her new environmental consulting business. Former students, fellow teachers, and supporters from around the state had helped her build a client base of conservation groups and ethical developers who wanted to ensure their projects met all environmental standards. Clara! A familiar voice called from the walking path. She turned to see Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Emma's pediatrician, approaching with her own young daughter. Jennifer, how nice to see you. I wanted to thank you again, Dr. Walsh said, watching Emma explore the shallow water under Clara's careful supervision. That little girl is like a different child since she's been with you. I've never seen such a dramatic improvement in a patient's health and development. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. She just needed someone to put her needs first. You know, there are other children in the system who could use that kind of advocacy. The state is always looking for qualified foster parents, especially ones with your background in child development and education. The suggestion planted a seed in Clara's mind. She'd spent so many years believing she was broken because she couldn't have biological children. But caring for Emma had taught her that love, dedication, and advocacy mattered far more than genetics. That evening, as Clara gave Emma her bath in their cozy bathroom, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. 12 months ago, she'd been a broken woman with no hope, no voice, and no value in her own eyes. The fertility struggles, the loss of her husband, the cruel dismissal by his family, all of it had convinced her that she was worthless. But Emma had shown her otherwise. This beautiful child, who'd been failed by everyone who was supposed to protect her, had thrived under Clara's care. The baby who'd been labeled difficult and impossible had simply needed someone to listen to what she was trying to communicate. "Mama," Emma said, splashing happily in the warm water. The word still made Clara's heart skip a beat every time she heard it. Double quotes, "Yes, baby girl. Love you." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she lifted Emma from the bath and wrapped her in a soft towel. "I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know." As she tucked Emma into bed that night, Clara read from their favorite book about birds and their habitats. Emma pointed at each picture, naming the animals she recognized, her vocabulary growing stronger every day. "The herons need clean water to catch fish," Clara read. "And the frogs need quiet places to lay their eggs. Every creature has something special it needs to thrive." Emma nodded seriously, as if she understood the deeper meaning behind the words. After Emma fell asleep, Clara sat on her front porch with a cup of tea, looking out over the moonlit preserve. Her phone rang. Another consulting client needing help navigating environmental regulations. Her calendar was full of meetings with conservation groups, citizen advocacy organizations, and ethical businesses who valued her expertise and moral courage. The woman who'd once been auctioned off as a desperate servant had become a respected voice for environmental protection and child welfare. The woman who'd been told she was worthless because she couldn't bear children had become a fierce advocate for vulnerable kids who needed someone to fight for them. Tomorrow, she would call Child Protective Services about becoming a licensed foster parent. There were other children like Emma out there, kids who needed someone to see past their difficult behaviors to their unmet needs, someone who would choose their well-being over convenience or profit. As Clara prepared for bed, she checked on Emma one last time. The toddler slept peacefully, her breathing steady and calm, surrounded by stuffed animals and picture books. In a room painted with murals of the local wildlife they observed together, Clara had learned that strength didn't come from avoiding vulnerability. It came from choosing to act with courage despite the fear. Love didn't require biology. It required commitment, sacrifice, and the daily choice to put another person's well-being above your own comfort. She'd lost everything she thought mattered: marriage, fertility, social status, financial security. But in losing those things, she'd found what actually mattered: the power to protect the vulnerable, the courage to speak truth to power, and the capacity to love without conditions or expectations. Emma had saved Clara just as much as Clara had saved Emma. Together, they built something neither could have achieved alone, a family based not on obligation or desperation, but on choice, love, and mutual respect. The wetlands beyond their window would continue to filter clean water for future generations. The man who tried to destroy them for profit would spend the next 15 years in prison, learning that some consequences couldn't be bought or intimidated away. And tomorrow would bring new opportunities to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, to speak for those who'd been silenced, and to love those who'd been abandoned. Clara smiled as she turned off the lights, knowing that the woman she'd once been, the environmental science teacher who'd inspired children to protect the natural world, had never really died. She'd just been buried under years of grief and shame, waiting for the right moment to emerge. That moment had come in the form of a crying baby who needed someone to truly hear her, and a threatened ecosystem that needed someone brave enough to stand up to powerful men who believed laws didn't apply to them. Some battles were worth losing everything to fight, and some victories were measured not in what you gained, but in who you became in the process of protecting what mattered most. As Clara drifted off to sleep, she could hear the gentle sounds of the preserve through her open window, frogs calling to their mates, night birds settling in their roosts, and the soft whisper of wind through the protected wetlands where herons would hunt at dawn. It was the sound of a world worth saving, tended by a woman who'd finally learned her own worth.